In The Varieties of Religious Experience, published in 1902, William James included a remarkable case study of a man overwhelmed by existential terror. The man described visiting a dark room and suddenly, without any external provocation, being seized by a sensation of absolute dread, a kind of philosophical horror at the contingency and vulnerability of existence that was so overwhelming it left him barely able to function for months. He recovered eventually, James reported, through a combination of religious faith and the slow return of his sense of agency. He never felt fully safe again, but he learned to live within the permanent possibility of terror without being destroyed by it. The case study was, in a thin disguise, James himself. The experience he described, probably occurring in 1870, during the worst years of his breakdown, was his own. The recovery he outlined was his own recovery. By presenting it as a third-person case study, he protected his privacy while communicating something genuinely important about the phenomenology of severe depression, that it is not merely sadness, but a kind of philosophical collapse, a loss of the sense that existence is safe or bearable or that one's own agency is real. James's depression in the late 1860s and early 1870s was entangled with his philosophical crisis in ways that make it difficult to separate the psychological from the intellectual. He had been trained in science and medicine. He understood the materialist argument for determinism. He could not find a coherent rebuttal to the claim that everything he thought, felt, and did was merely the product of prior physical causes. If that was true, then his sense of making choices was an illusion. And if his choices were illusory, then his suffering was pointless. There was no agency doing the suffering, no self who could change anything, just a mechanism running its program. This is not the ordinary depression of someone whose life has gone wrong. It is the depression of a man who has thought his way into a philosophical trap and cannot think his way out. The intellectual gifts that would eventually make James one of the most influential minds in American history were, in his 20s, partly responsible for his psychological breakdown. He understood the determinist argument too clearly to dismiss it, and he could not yet articulate the pragmatist response that would eventually dissolve it. The resolution came in stages. Renouvière's philosophy of free will gave him a conceptual foothold, not a proof, but a workable hypothesis. Acting as though his choices mattered had actual effects on his behavior and on how he felt. This was evidence of something, even if James could not immediately specify what. Over the following years, as his depression gradually lifted and he began to engage productively with teaching, writing, and research, he accumulated more evidence that the hypothesis of meaningful agency was at least as well supported by experience as the determinist alternative. What he learned from this process informed everything he would later write about psychology, philosophy, and religion. The concept of the sick soul, that he developed in the Varieties of Religious Experience, was not an abstraction. It was a category he had inhabited personally. The sick soul, as James described it, is the person who cannot achieve the easy optimism of what he called the healthy-minded, the person for whom the darkness of existence is not a problem to be solved or ignored but a fact that must be integrated into any honest account of what it means to be alive. James did not romanticize the sick soul. He did not claim that suffering was good or that depression produced wisdom automatically. He knew perfectly well that suffering often produced nothing except more suffering, and that the people who emerged from breakdowns with genuine insight were not the majority. But he believed that the people who had passed through genuine darkness and come out the other side possessed a kind of knowledge about human experience that the healthy-minded, for all their energy and optimism, could not access. They knew, in a way that could not be faked or summarized, that existence was fragile, that the ground could disappear, and that any account of human life that did not include this knowledge was simply incomplete. The twice-born personality that James celebrated in the Varieties of Religious Experience was, in significant part, a self-portrait. The wisdom he was describing, the kind that comes from passing through genuine darkness and emerging on the other side with a more hard-won and more inclusive sense of what existence is, was wisdom he had earned personally. This is why his treatment of depression and religious crisis rings true in a way that purely academic treatments rarely do. He was not observing from a distance. He was reporting from the interior. His experience also gave him a practical orientation toward mental health that was ahead of his time. He understood that philosophical beliefs had psychological consequences, that what you believed about free will, meaning, and agency was not merely an intellectual matter but a matter of how you were able to live. He understood that recovery was not a linear process and that it required finding workable hypotheses, not final proofs. And he understood that the self that emerged from depression was not the same as the self that had entered it, that something had been permanently altered, and that the task was not to return to the previous state but to build something new from what the darkness had revealed. Subscribe to The Psychology of William James to explore more of his timeless ideas.